From the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, this is Nebraska Farmcast, and I'm Ryan Evans. When farmers and ranchers think about estate and transition planning, the focus is often on what happens when a key person in the operation dies. But what if that person becomes disabled to the point that they can no longer perform their duties and maybe even have trouble being able to communicate what needs to be done? Jessica Groskopf is an extension agricultural economist with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, who has a new article up on our site at cap.unl.edu about the importance of including disability considerations in the transition and estate planning process and aspects to think about so that the farm or ranch can continue operating smoothly. She joins me now. Thanks for being here, Jessica.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
Could you just start by explaining why it's critical for farmers and ranchers to include disability in their estate and transition planning?
Yeah, I think a lot of times when we think about estate and transition planning, it really revolves around death. But there are other moments that may force an operation to change management. And one of those moments could be the possible disability of a family member. So I think it's really important that as we look at our farm and our ranch operation, that we have these contingency plans, especially for disability.
And you write about that in the article again, suggesting having those contingency plans, especially for labor in case of disability. So could you just walk through what a robust contingency plan might look like for a family-run operation?
So I think one of the biggest challenges when we think about disability is not knowing how long that may last. So as we think about labor in particular, I think there's short-term plans and there are long-term plans. So if you're hospitalized for whatever reason, in the meantime, who's going to be feeding cattle? Who's going to be running the tractor? Who's going to be irrigating those fields? Those kind of short-term ideas are something that just need to be handled. I think a good contingency plan here is that we've cross-trained family members in those kinds of operations. So, how do we go about doing these specific day-to-day tasks that need to be handled? That works in the short term. In the longer term, we need to start talking about management. And there's a few more things we need to do when it comes to financial decisions, but even just day-to-day management of what are the rations, what bills need to be paid, how are we going to make production decisions without this person here. And so that's something that I think is really important as we talk about the labor, is both a short-term plan and a long-term plan, and well cross-trained family members and employees.
And you mentioned the financial considerations at play here. And one of your key recommendations in the article is establishing an emergency fund. So how should farmers and ranchers calculate the appropriate size of the fund? And then what are some best practices for managing that fund?
So an emergency plan is a key part of any personal financial management plan. Most financial advisors recommend that folks have between 3 and 6 months of expenses available in a liquid account. Typically, they recommend that that's in some sort of easily accessible account like a high yield savings account. How do we decide whether we need 3 months or 6 months? And that really depends on your situation. If you are the primary breadwinner, and you were to lose your job, you're probably going to need closer to that 6-month range. If you have a dual income household, we might be looking at closer to that 3-month range. Now, for farmers and ranchers, I might argue that we could see a larger emergency fund that's built up. But again, the industry standard is between 3 and 6 months, again, depending on whether you have a single source of income or a dual source of income. And, it's really important that, again, we put those dollars in somewhere that's really accessible. We're not going to put that into an investment account or something like that. Again, probably a high yield savings account is the most commonly recommended type of account we keep those funds in.
Great. And a legal entity can help protect farms and ranches and their assets. So what are some considerations that you would recommend farmers and ranchers should keep in mind when they're setting up and maintaining maybe an LLC or an S corporation?
So first of all, if you're considering some sort of entity type, I highly recommend that you talk to your tax accountant and your attorney, preferably in the same meeting, about what type of entity that you should have. If you already have one of these entities established, I think the next step is making sure that you are following the operating agreement. So that usually includes separate bank accounts, insurance, accounting, and that we're hosting annual meetings. By following that operating agreement, we're able to prove that it is technically a separate legal entity. And that really helps if we have a lot of medical debt and creditors to start to question whether or not it truly is operated as a separate legal entity. If they see that you've been following that operating agreement, it's much more difficult for them to access assets within that entity.
And continuing down the legal road here, powers of attorney for financial decisions and powers of attorney for healthcare decisions are two important aspects that we talk a lot about here in the Center for Ag Profitability. The differences between them can be nuanced. Can you just explain the importance of each of those documents and how they function together when it comes to disability planning?
So I want to be very clear that they are two separate legal documents that can appoint two separate people to make decisions on your behalf when you become disabled. These documents are established and live until your death, but they do expire at your death. The first is a regular power of attorney, and this person or agent is someone that you assign that can make business decisions on your behalf. So this would be a trusted person, especially for farms and ranches that would understand the business side of your operation, but also might have to make some personal financial decisions on your behalf while you are incapacitated. The second is a power of attorney for healthcare. And I think this is a really important person. This person's going to help make medical decisions on your behalf. Now, these do not have to be the same person, but in the case of where you're possibly disabled, um, we want them to work together, right? And so that's something that's really interesting. Again, it depends on the level of disability that you would have. So we want to make sure that they're very aware of what your wishes are in terms of how you want the business handled, but also your healthcare decisions. So along with these documents, I also ask that you pair a living will or advanced medical directive with them. So that makes for 3 documents that we're looking at: a power of attorney, a power of attorney for healthcare, and a living will or an advanced medical directive that outline exactly how you want things handled.
Great. And you also discuss buy-sell agreements in your article, especially buy-sell agreements with provisions for disability, something that maybe many farmers and ranchers might not consider right away. So can you just share how such an agreement can help provide stability and predictability for farm and ranch operations?
So I think a lot of us have buy-sell agreements or other types of continuity plans within our operation. I think this goes maybe a little bit beyond buy-sell agreements, but that's the example I have in the article. When you have something like a buy-sell agreement or a long-term lease agreement, do you have provisions in that agreement for something that is not death? Again, most of the time we're in an estate plan, we're thinking about death, but for this particular situation, if that person becomes so disabled that they are unwilling or unable to work within the operation, is there an opportunity for them to sell? And what does that look like under the provisions of those continuity agreements, like a buy-sell agreement? So I think this is really an interesting idea and thought as we move forward to go back and review your estate plan and say, what happens if I become disabled, or my partner becomes disabled, or my children become disabled? What does that look like? And how does that work within what we already have in place, like in a buy-sell agreement?
How about when it comes to disability insurance? Can you give some insight on what's important for farmers and ranchers to consider if they're weighing the costs and the benefits of disability insurance against the potential benefits from Social Security?
So for other career paths, we would be talking about disability insurance as a way to mitigate some of these risks. But for farmers and ranchers, the reality is that disability insurance may be unaffordable. The premiums may be so high that it's not worth it. So what I like to look at is, if you are eligible, I would look into disability insurance and see what it would cost. However, I would also make sure that you qualify for Social Security benefits. So as a farmer or rancher, when we look at Social Security benefits, that means that we will be paying taxes. And so we have to pay so much per year in taxes in order, or in self-employment taxes, to qualify for Social Security benefits. And Social Security is really kind of interesting. The definition of disability is very severe, but if you are severely disabled, it can be very, very helpful to help you get through that tougher time. So when I look at it, look at disability insurance, but also make sure that you are paying enough Social Security or self-employment tax to qualify for Social Security benefits, because they do apply for disability.
And as always, with so many of these suggestions that you're laying out, or ideas that you're laying out in this article, it's important for people to check with their legal professionals, their financial advisors and such, right?
Yeah, so when we talk about farm estate and transition planning, we're always talking about working with a team. And again, you need not only an attorney, but also a tax accountant, potentially a banker, an insurance agent, a financial advisor, who are all working together to make sure that from every facet of this plan that it truly works, and that it doesn't just work for death, it also works for other things like disability.
All right, that's Jessica Groskopf, an extension educator and agricultural economist with the Center for Agricultural Profitability here at UNL. Again, you can find this article on what happens to your farm and ranch if you become disabled. That's on our website for the center at cap.unl.edu, and it is linked to in the podcast notes wherever you might be listening to this. Jessica, thanks so much.
Thanks, Ryan.
Nebraska Farmcast is a production of the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. For the latest research-based information and education resources to manage your farm or ranch operation, visit our website at cap.unl.edu. That's cap.unl.edu.